Picture this. A millionaire wakes up in a luxury hotel suite, his mistress beside him, champagne bottles scattered across the marble floor. He checks his phone, expecting nothing unusual. But what he finds makes his blood run cold. 47 missed calls. A text from his lawyer that reads, "Your wife just transferred $87 million out of your accounts. Check the penthouse. Now." At that exact moment, 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, his pregnant wife, the woman he thought he'd broken, the woman he'd locked in a psychiatric ward just weeks before, sits in a billionaire's private jet, signing divorce papers with a steady hand. Her baby kicks inside her. She smiles, and she whispers, "He has no idea what's coming." This is the story of Claire Hartford, a woman who was supposed to disappear quietly. Instead, she became the architect of her husband's complete destruction. This is a story about betrayal, revenge, and what happens when you underestimate the wrong woman. But here's what you need to know before we begin. Nothing in this story is what it seems. The pregnant wife isn't the victim. The billionaire isn't the hero. And the millionaire? He's not even the worst villain in this tale. So buckle up, because what you're about to hear will make you question everyone you trust, reconsider everything you thought you knew about love and power, and maybe, just maybe, make you want to check your own bank accounts when this is over. This is the story of how one woman turned betrayal into a weapon and destroyed an empire with nothing but evidence, patience, and ice-cold rage. Let's begin. The silk sheets of the Aurora Grand Hotel felt like liquid gold against Adrian Vale's skin as consciousness crept back into his mind. 7:47 in the morning. In the Manhattan skyline outside, the floor-to-ceiling windows blazed with early autumn light. He stretched lazily, a satisfied smirk pulling at his lips as he reached for his Rolex on the nightstand. $28,000 worth of Swiss engineering confirmed what he already knew. He was winning at life. Behind him, Scarlett Ross lay tangled in the sheets. Her fire engine red hair spilled across the pillow like a declaration of sin. Empty champagne bottles stood sentry on the marble countertop. Her phone, face down on the nightstand, buzzed with notifications she was too exhausted to check. Adrian watched her sleep for a moment, feeling the familiar rush of conquest that had become his addiction. She was 24, Instagram famous, and hungry for the lifestyle only his money could provide. "God, I'm good at this," he whispered to himself, reaching for his phone. At the exact same moment, 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, Claire Hartford Vale pressed her pen to paper and signed her name for the final time. The divorce documents felt heavy in her hands, though they weighed nothing at all. Across from her, Dominic Ashford sat in quiet observation, his gray threaded hair catching the cabin light. He didn't hover or pressure. He simply existed as a steady presence, the way mountains exist. Claire placed the pen down with deliberate care and whispered, "He still thinks I'm in our bed." Rachel Pierce, Dominic's executive assistant, handed Claire a crystal glass of sparkling water. The older woman's eyes held no pity, only respect. That meant everything. The Gulfstream's engines hummed their constant song as the world below became smaller, less significant. Claire's hand rested on her 7-month belly, feeling the flutter of life inside. Her baby girl, unaware that everything had just changed. At the exact moment Adrian Vale woke up feeling invincible, the story would later be told, his pregnant wife was already signing away their marriage, 30,000 feet above the ocean. But this wasn't impulse, this was war, and Claire had been planning it for 12 weeks. But to understand how they arrived at this split-screen moment, him in a hotel suite with his mistress, her on a billionaire's private jet, we need to go back. Back to where the cracks first appeared in what looked like a perfect life, 12 weeks earlier. The penthouse overlooking Central Park had always felt more like a museum than a home. $12 million bought a lot of marble, a lot of Italian furniture chosen by designers Claire had never met, and a lot of empty space that echoed when you walked through it alone, which she did. Often. Claire Hartford had been born in Charlotte, North Carolina, to parents who worked honest jobs and loved each other through 30 years of marriage. Her father, Robert, coached high school football and taught history until a heart attack took him when Claire was 19. Her mother, Diane, had been an emergency room nurse for 40 years, her hands always busy, always healing. They'd raised Claire and her older brother Jackson in a modest three-bedroom house where love was never in short supply, even when money was. Jackson. God, she missed Jackson. Her brother had been the golden boy, quarterback, straight-A student, the kind of person who made friends everywhere he went. He died 10 years ago in a drunk driving accident, though he hadn't been the one drinking. Some college kid had blown through a red light at 70 miles per hour. Jackson died instantly. He was 28. Claire had been 22 then, fresh out of UNC Chapel Hill and with a degree in art history and dreams of working in museums. She'd gotten in that job at the North Carolina Museum of Art, giving tours to school groups, teaching children to see not just paint on canvas, but stories and emotions and human connection. Those had been good years, simple years. She'd lived in a tiny apartment, driven a 2008 Honda Civic that had required duct tape to keep the dashboard from rattling, and been genuinely happy. Then she'd met Adrian Vale at a charity auction 4 years ago. He'd been the keynote speaker, Wall Street's rising star, self-made millionaire by 31, the kind of man who commanded attention simply by walking into a room. During the silent auction, he'd approached her while she was bidding on a signed first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird. "You're the only person here who looks like they actually care about the cause," he'd said, his smile disarming. Claire had been startled. She'd worn a simple black dress from Target, her brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. Around her, women dripped diamonds and designer labels. "How can you tell? You're bidding on books, not golf trips." He gestured to her auction paddle. "I like that." The whirlwind had started that night, flowers delivered to the museum, handwritten notes that quoted poetry, surprise visits during her lunch break. Adrian had been relentless in his pursuit, and Claire, still grieving her father and lonely in ways she hadn't admitted, had let herself fall. "You're different," Adrian had told her 6 months into their courtship. "You're real." "Everyone in my world is fake, Claire. They want something from me, but you just want me." Her mother had been skeptical from the start. "Sweetie, men with that much money are used to getting what they want. Just be careful." But Claire hadn't been careful. She'd been 28 and wanted to believe in fairy tales again. When Adrian proposed after 9 months, she'd said yes without hesitation. The wedding had been small, Adrian's insistence. "Just us," he'd said. "I don't want the circus." They'd married at City Hall with 2 witnesses pulled from the street. Looking back, Claire realized he'd been hiding her from his world even then. The move to Manhattan had been jarring. The penthouse felt cold from day one. Adrian worked constantly, late nights at the office, business trips to Miami and Los Angeles and Dallas. When Claire suggested joining him, he'd kiss her forehead and say, "Babe, it's boring investor stuff. You'd hate it." She'd tried to make the penthouse feel like home. She'd bought plants and books and tried to cook elaborate meals, but Adrian was never there to eat them. His phone, once casually left on counters, became password protected. His laptop stayed locked. He'd installed a home office with a door that he always kept closed. Then, 4 months ago, Claire had taken a pregnancy test. 2 pink lines had appeared, clear as destiny. Her hands had trembled as she'd stared at them. She was going to be a mother. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. When she told Adrian that evening, his reaction had surprised her. His face had lit up with something that looked genuine for the first time in months. "We're having a baby?" He'd pulled her into his arms, kissed her deeply, placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "I'm going to be a dad. Claire, this is incredible." For 2 weeks he'd been present, attentive. He'd researched cribs and asked about her doctor appointments and talked about baby names. Claire had let herself hope that maybe the baby would fix what had broken between them. But by month 5 of her pregnancy, the late nights had returned. The locked phone, the business trips, and then Claire had found the receipt. She'd been doing laundry, a task the cleaning service usually handled, but she'd wanted to feel useful when she checked Adrian's jacket pockets out of habit. The crumpled paper had been jammed into the inner pocket. Per se restaurant, $8,347.52 for 2 guests. Date stamped 3 days ago. The night Adrian had said he was at a board dinner. Claire had stood in the laundry room, receipt in hand, feeling the world tilt beneath her feet. She'd checked her phone calendar. No mention of per se. She'd texted Adrian casually. "How was the board dinner last Thursday?" His reply had come immediately. Exhausting. Chinese food in a conference room. Still full. Ha ha ha. Liar. That had been the moment Claire Hartford Vale stopped being naive. Standing in a laundry room holding an $8,300 receipt, 5 months pregnant, she'd made a decision that would change everything. She'd opened a secret email account, just in case 2024 at protonmail.com. She'd photographed the receipt and emailed it to herself. She'd started taking pictures of his credit card statements when he left them on his desk. She'd begun documenting everything. "I hope I'm wrong," she'd whispered to her unborn daughter, hand on her belly. "But if I'm not, I need proof." 2 weeks later at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep because of heartburn, Claire had been scrolling Instagram when she'd seen that. A post from Scarlet Fire NYC, an influencer with 412,000 followers. The photo showed a beautiful woman with red hair on a rooftop bar, Manhattan's skyline glittering behind her. The caption read, "City lights and champagne nights, NYC vibes, blessed." But it wasn't the woman that had made Claire's stomach drop. It was the background, blurred but unmistakable. A man's wrist wearing a Patek Philippe Nautilus in rose gold. Claire had given Adrian that watch for their second anniversary. $32,000, custom engraved on the back. Forever C. Her hands had started shaking. She'd zoomed in on the photo, screenshot it, and reverse image searched the location. The Skylark, West 39th Street. She'd pulled up Adrian's credit card statement, the one she'd photographed 2 days earlier. There it was, a charge from the Skylark on the same date as Scarlett's post. Claire had run to the bathroom and vomited. Not morning sickness. Shock. She'd stood in front of the mirror afterward, hands gripping the marble sink, and stared at herself. Her face was pale, her brown hair limp, her body swollen with pregnancy. When had she become invisible? But the nausea had been accompanied by something else. Something cold and sharp. Clarity. Her OBGYN's words from the last appointment echoed, "Any severe stress could trigger preterm labor. You're only 5 months along. We need to be careful." Claire had made a decision right there. She wouldn't confront Adrian, not yet. She was too early in her pregnancy, too vulnerable, too dependent. Instead, she would wait. She would gather evidence. She would plan. She would survive. Because the woman staring back at her from that mirror wasn't the naive girl from North Carolina anymore. She was a mother-to-be who just discovered her husband was a liar. And mothers, when threatened, become dangerous. Claire had gone back to bed that night and lain awake until dawn, her mind working through possibilities. She didn't know it yet, but the stranger she'd later meet in a bathroom at a charity gala had been right. She was stronger than she thought. 6 months pregnant now, and Claire's body had begun to show her condition clearly. The simple navy maternity gown she'd chosen for the Bright Horizons gala felt modest compared to what other women wore, but she'd stopped trying to compete. The event was a fundraiser for children's literacy, ironic, given what was about to unfold. That morning, Adrian had kissed her forehead while checking his phone. "Babe, emergency board meeting. I'll meet you at the gala by 8, okay?" Claire had nodded, knowing he was lying. She'd stopped believing him weeks ago, but she'd smiled and said, "Okay, love you." The words felt like ash in her mouth. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's Great Hall blazed with light and money. Chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks. Women glided past in gowns that cost more than cars. Men in tuxedos exchanged business cards between glasses of champagne that cost $200 per bottle. An orchestra played Mozart while servers in white gloves offered canapes that Claire couldn't eat because her stomach was in knots. She'd arrived at 7:30, hoping to find a quiet corner before Adrian showed up. But as she entered the main hall, scanning the crowd, she saw him immediately. And he wasn't alone. Adrian stood near the center of the room, his tuxedo perfectly tailored, his smile bright and confident. On his arm, clinging to him like ivy, was the woman from Instagram, Scarlett Ross in the flesh. Her red hair cascaded over bare shoulders. Her dress was crimson silk, skin tight, with a slit that reached mid-thigh. She laughed at something Adrian said, throwing her head back, touching his chest with familiar ease. The room seemed to tilt. Claire watched as a photographer approached them. "Mr. Vale, over here." Adrian turned, still smiling, and Scarlett posed beside him. The photographer called out, "Give us a kiss." And Adrian did. He leaned in and kissed Scarlett's cheek. Flash, flash, flash. The sounds of the gala, the orchestra, the laughter, the clinking glasses, all faded into white noise. Claire's vision narrowed to that single image. Her husband kissing another woman while she, his pregnant wife, stood 30 feet away, invisible. The whispers started almost immediately. People had seen her enter. People knew who she was. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. The pregnant wife in the modest blue dress, standing alone while her husband paraded his mistress. "Oh my God, is that his wife?" "She's pregnant. He brought that Instagram girl. How humiliating." Scarlett noticed her then. Their eyes locked across the crowded room, and Scarlett smiled. Not a friendly smile, a knowing smile. Victorious. She leaned in and whispered something in Adrian's ear. He glanced toward Claire, and for a moment their eyes met. Claire saw the flash of recognition, maybe even guilt. But then he shrugged, actually shrugged, and turned back to Scarlett. They laughed together. Claire's chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. The room was too hot, too bright, too full of people watching her humiliation. A waiter approached, concerned. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She pushed past him, stumbling toward the nearest hallway. She found the women's restroom and burst through the door, making it to the sink before the sobs came. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman breaking apart. Mascara streaking, hands shaking, shoulders heaving with the kind of crying that comes from someplace deep and primal. The bathroom door opened. An older woman entered, elegant, 50s, wearing pearls and a kind expression. She saw Claire and paused. "Honey," the woman said softly, "I saw what happened out there." Claire tried to speak but could only shake her head. The woman approached and placed a gentle hand on Claire's shoulder. "Men like him don't change. But you're stronger than you think." "I'm pregnant," Claire managed through tears. "I can't do this alone." "You're not alone, Shay." The woman reached into her clutch and pulled out a business card. She placed it on the counter beside the sink. "You just don't know it yet." Before Claire could respond, the woman left as quietly as she'd entered. Claire picked up the card with trembling fingers. Cream-colored cardstock, embossed lettering. Rachel Pierce, Executive Assistant to Dominic Ashford, CEO, Apex Innovations. Dominic Ashford. The name stirred something in Claire's memory. Jackson's friend, her brother's best friend from college. She hadn't thought about Dominic in years, not since Jackson's funeral, when they'd stood together in the rain while the rest of the world blurred into grief. She slipped the card into her clutch and splashed cold water on her face. When she looked at herself again, something had shifted. The crying woman was still there, but behind her eyes was something else now. Something harder. Something that had been dormant for too long. Claire dried her face, fixed her makeup as best she could, and walked out of that bathroom with her spine straight and her head high. She didn't return to the gala. She took the service exit and called a car. As Manhattan blurred past the window, she pulled out her phone and stared at the business card she'd photographed. Not tonight. She wasn't ready tonight. But soon. When Claire arrived at the penthouse, Adrian was already there, sitting in the living room with a glass of scotch like nothing had happened. "Where were you?" he asked, not looking up from his phone. "I came home." "You embarrassed me, leaving like that." Something snapped inside Claire. "I embarrassed you?" Adrian finally looked at her. "Don't start, Claire. You're being emotional. It's the hormones. You brought your mistress to a charity gala. Scarlett is a brand ambassador for one of my key investors. It was business. You kissed her. On the cheek. For a photo. Jesus, Claire, you're being paranoid." He stood and walked over at her. His hand touched her belly, and she wanted to flinch away but didn't. "I would never risk our family," he said, his voice softening into the tone he used when he wanted something. "You know that." And because she was 6 months pregnant and terrified and didn't know what else to do, Claire let him hold her. Mistake number 1. The anonymous email arrived the next morning while Adrian was in the shower. Claire sat at the kitchen island, Trying to eat yogurt her stomach didn't want, when her secret email account pinged. She'd gotten into the habit of checking it every morning, documenting Adrian's lies in a folder she'd labeled bold evidence. Sender, anonymous, Warsh 76 at Proton Da. Subject, he's not with just one. Her hand stilled on the spoon. She opened the email. Aurora Grand Hotel, room 1407, tonight 9 p.m. See for yourself. Attached was a photograph. Adrian entering the hotel lobby with a brunette woman Claire had never seen before. Not Scarlett, someone else. Claire's heart hammered against her ribs. She heard the shower turn off in the master bathroom. She closed the email quickly and deleted it from her inbox, but it stayed in her mind all day. By evening, she'd made a decision. Mom, can you come over? She'd texted Diane. Her mother arrived within an hour, her nurse's instinct immediately picking up that something was wrong. Claire, you look terrible. What's going on? Just tired. Can you stay for a bit? I need to run an errand. An errand at 8 at night, honey. Please, Mom. Diane studied her daughter's face, then nodded. Okay, but call me if you need anything. Claire took an Uber to the Aurora Grand Hotel. The building rose like a glass monument in Midtown, all luxury and discretion. She walked through the lobby with her heart in her throat, past doormen who barely glanced at her, into an elevator that smelled of expensive perfume. 14th floor, room 1407. She stood outside the door, listening. Voices inside. Trina's voice, clear and confident. She signed the post-nup. Everything's locked down. She gets nothing. A woman's voice, unfamiliar, sultry. You're ruthless, Adrian. I love it. Laughter. When are you leaving her? After the baby. Custody battle's easier if I'm the devoted father. The words hit Claire like physical blows. But she didn't run. She pushed. The door was unlocked, left ajar by housekeeping, maybe, or maybe Adrian's arrogance had made him careless. It swung open with barely a touch. Inside, on the king-size bed with its Egyptian cotton sheets and too many pillows, Adrian sat with another woman. Not Scarlett. This woman was older, brunette, elegant in silk lingerie, and pregnant, visibly, undeniably pregnant. 8 months, if Claire had to guess. Time stopped. Adrian saw her, his face drained of color. Claire! The woman sat up, completely unashamed. Oh, you must be the wife. Claire's voice came out steady, which surprised her. You're pregnant. 8 months. The woman smiled. Adrian and I have been together for 2 years. 2 years. They'd only been married for 3. Claire, let me explain. Adrian scrambled out of bed, grabbing for his pants, but Claire wasn't listening anymore. She pulled out her phone and took a photograph. Adrian lunged for it. Don't you dare! Claire stepped back. Touch me, and I call the police. She turned and walked out, closing the door behind her with a soft click. She made it to the elevator, pressed the button, waited. The doors opened. She stepped inside. And the moment they closed, her legs gave out. She collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. Her vision blurred. Her chest felt like it was caving in. A guest who boarded on the 10th floor took one look at her and pulled out his phone. I'm calling 911, he said. Claire tried to protest, but then the pain started. Sharp, cramping pain in her abdomen that made her double over. The contractions had begun. The emergency room at Mount Sinai was a blur of bright lights and urgent voices. A doctor, young, efficient, concerned, examined her while a nurse hooked her up to monitors. Mrs. Vale, you're having contractions. You're only 28 weeks. If we don't stop these, you could deliver tonight. Will my baby survive? Claire's voice cracked. At 28 weeks, there are significant risks. We're giving you medication to stop the labor, but you need to stay calm. No stress. Claire almost laughed. No stress. Her entire life was a lie. Her husband was a serial cheater. She just discovered he was planning to take her baby after using her for a custody advantage. No stress. She lay in the hospital bed, hooked to IV lines and monitors, listening to the steady beep of her daughter's heartbeat. The medication made her drowsy, made thinking difficult, but one thought broke through clearly. She had to survive this. Not for her, for her baby. When Adrian burst through the door 2 hours later, tears streaming down his face, Claire felt nothing, not anger, not even disgust, just a profound, echoing emptiness. He fell to his knees beside her bed. Baby, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And the nurses watched from the doorway, probably thinking this was a touching scene of a husband devastated by almost losing his wife and child. It's over with them, Adrian continued, gripping her hand. All of them. I swear on our baby's life. I'll go to therapy. I'll do anything. Please, don't leave me. I can't lose you both. The medication made Claire's tongue thick. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him exactly what she thought of his performance. But the doctor's words echoed. No stress. So she nodded. Just once, but so am I. Okay. Adrian kissed her forehead, relief flooding his features. I love you so much. As he left to make some calls, Claire saw him check his phone in the hallway. She saw the smile that crossed his face before he caught himself. That was when she knew with absolute certainty nothing he'd said was true. Mistake number 2, believing he could change. The doctor kept Claire in the hospital for 10 days. Bed rest, monitoring, medication to keep the contractions at bay. Adrian visited daily, playing the devoted husband for the nursing staff. But Claire noticed everything now. How he checked his phone constantly, how he always stepped out to take calls, how his smile never quite reached his eyes. On the 8th night, she pretended to be asleep. Adrian sat in the chair beside her bed, scrolling through his phone. Then he stood and walked into the hallway just outside her door. His voice carried clearly in the quiet hospital corridor. Yeah, it's handled. She's not going anywhere. Pause. Trust me, by the time the baby comes, I'll have full control. The post-nup locks her out of everything. Pause. She's too weak to fight back. She never has been. Claire's eyes stayed closed, but her mind was wide awake. That night, after Adrian left, she took out her phone and stared at the business card she'd photographed at the gala. Rachel Pierce, Dominic Ashford, her brother's best friend. Jackson had loved Dominic like a brother. They'd met freshman year at Duke, roommates who became inseparable. Dominic had been there when Jackson died, had spoken at his funeral, had stood beside Claire in the rain while they lowered the casket into the ground. She remembered his words. If you ever need anything, Claire, anything at all, call me. She'd been too proud then, too determined to handle life on her own. But now she was a pregnant woman whose husband was planning to steal her child and frame her for crimes she didn't commit. Now she was trapped in a hospital by him, financially dependent on a man who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle. Now she needed help. Claire opened her secret email and began typing. Mr. Ashford, you don't know me anymore, but you knew my brother Jackson, Hartford. This is his sister Claire. I'm in trouble, and I don't have anyone else to turn to. If you meant what you said at Jackson's funeral, that I could call if I needed help, I'm calling now, please. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The response came 3 hours later. Claire was dozing, medicated, and exhausted when her phone buzzed. Claire, Rachel Pierce here, assistant to Dominic Ashford. Mr. Ashford received your message and wants you to know help is already on the way. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. We're going to get you out. Hold on. For the first time in months, Claire cried tears that weren't born from despair. They were tears of hope. Claire was discharged from the hospital on a Tuesday morning. The contractions had stopped, her blood pressure stabilized, and the baby's heartbeat remained strong and steady. Adrian drove her home in his Mercedes, one hand on the wheel and one hand periodically touching her knee in a gesture that probably looked affectionate from the outside but felt like ownership. I'm going to take care of you, Sari said as they pulled into the underground parking garage of their building. Everything's going to be different now, Claire. I promise. She nodded and said nothing. She'd learned that silence was sometimes the smartest weapon. The penthouse felt even colder than she remembered. Adrian helped her to the couch, fussing over pillows, adjusting the temperature, bringing her water she didn't want, playing caretaker, building his narrative of the devoted husband should things ever end up in court. I'm going to work from home for a few days, he announced, just to make sure you're okay. Translation, to make sure she couldn't contact anyone or make plans without him knowing. Claire spent those days pretending to rest while actually cataloging everything. She noticed which drawers he kept locked. She memorized his laptop password when he typed it in while sitting across from her. She listened to his phone calls from behind closed doors and recorded what she could on her phone. 2 days after her discharge, Adrian sat down across from her at breakfast with a thick stack of papers. "Claire, I've been thinking." His tone was serious, measured. "After what happened, the scare with the baby, I realized we need to get our affairs in order. For the baby's protection." He slid the document across the table. The words post-nuptial agreement gleamed at the top in bold font. "My lawyer drew this up. It's just estate planning stuff. Make sure the baby's trust fund is protected, clarifies assets, that kind of thing." Claire looked at the document without touching it. It had to be 60 pages. "This is a lot of papers. It's mostly legal jargon. My lawyer already reviewed everything. It's standard. Can I read it tonight?" Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It's really straightforward, Claire. We should sign it today so we can. Then one more night won't matter." She kept her voice gentle, even a little sleepy. "My head's still fuzzy from the hospital. I just want to make sure I understand it." She saw the calculation in his eyes. Push too hard, and she might get suspicious. He forced a smile. "Of course. Take your time." That afternoon, while Adrian was in his office on a conference call, Claire photographed every single page. She used a technique she'd learned from a documentary about investigative journalists, angling her phone to avoid glare, making sure every word was legible. She emailed all 60 pages to her secret account, then deleted the sent messages from her phone's email app. Then she texted the number Rachel Pierce had given her. "Need lawyer tonight. He wants me to sign something. Sent photos to secure email." The response came within minutes. "Lawyer reviewing now. Do not sign. We're working on next steps." When Adrian emerged from his office at 6, Claire was sitting at the kitchen table with the document open in front of her, a pen beside it. "I'm reading it," she said simply. He relaxed. "Great, let me know if you have questions." At 3 in the morning, then Adrian woke up and found Claire still at the table, documents spread around her, making notes on a legal pad. "What are you doing?" His voice had an edge now. "Reading, like you said I could." "It's 3 a.m. I couldn't sleep. Baby keeps kicking." Adrian walked over and snatched the papers from in front of her. "You don't trust me?" Claire looked up at him with the expression she'd perfected over the last 10 days. Hurt, confused, a little afraid. "I just want to understand it. You said I could read it." "Fine." He threw the document on the table. "We'll do this the hard way." He stormed back to the bedroom. Claire heard the door slam. The next morning, she woke to find her bank account frozen. She discovered it when she tried to buy coffee at the Starbucks on the corner. Her credit card declined. She tried another card, declined. Confused, she pulled out her phone and checked her banking app. Account unavailable. Contact your bank for details. Heart pounding, she called the number. The representative's voice was professionally sympathetic. "Mrs. Vale, your account was closed yesterday per your husband's authorization. He's the primary account holder. But it's a joint account. Your name was removed from the account yesterday afternoon. You'll need to speak with Mr. Vale about—" Claire hung up. She stood on the corner of 5th Avenue and 72nd Street, 7 months pregnant with $38 in cash in her wallet and no access to money. Around her, New York City moved at its relentless pace, everyone rushing somewhere important, no one noticing the woman whose entire financial life had just been erased. Her phone was on Adrian's plan. He could shut that off anytime. She had no car in her name. The penthouse belonged to him. Every credit card was issued under his accounts. She thought she was being smart by waiting, by gathering evidence, by being strategic. But Adrian had been 3 steps ahead the entire time. This was the second peak of despair. Not just emotional devastation, but practical, physical powerlessness. She was trapped in every way that mattered. Claire walked slowly back to the penthouse, her mind racing. When she entered, Adrian was drinking coffee at the kitchen island, scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened. "Did you freeze my accounts?" Her voice was steady. He looked up with an expression of surprise that was almost convincing. "I consolidated our finances. For simplicity, everything runs through my accounts now." "You didn't tell me." "I'm telling you now." He set down his phone. "Claire, This is what partners do. They trust each other. Or don't you trust me? It was a trap question, and they both knew it. Before she could answer, the penthouse door opened. A woman walked in with her own key, wearing designer jeans and a leather jacket that probably cost more than Claire's wedding dress. Scarlett Ross, in their home. "Hey, babe," she said to Adrian, not even glancing at Claire. Then, as if noticing her for the first time, "Oh, Claire, hi." Adrian stood. "Scarlett's going to be helping with some social media strategy for the firm. She'll be working out of the home office." Claire stared at him. "You brought her here. It's business." His tone warned her not to make a scene. Scarlett walked past Claire into Adrian's office and shut the door behind her. For a long moment, Claire stood in her own kitchen, pregnant and powerless, while her husband's mistress made herself comfortable 10 feet away. She could feel the walls closing in. No money, no car, no escape. And now the woman who'd helped destroy her marriage was in her home. But in her pocket, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "This is attorney Catherine Mills. I work with Dominic Ashford. Everything Adrian just did is illegal. We're building your case. You're not alone. Hold on. Help is coming." Claire deleted the message and looked at her husband, who'd already returned to his phone, completely unconcerned. He thought he'd won. He had no idea the war had only just begun. Over the next 2 weeks, Adrian systematically dismantled what remained of Claire's independence. Scarlett became a fixture in the penthouse, working in Adrian's office with the door closed, emerging occasionally to make snide comments wrapped in false sweetness. "Pregnancy really takes a toll, doesn't it?" she'd say, eyeing Claire's swollen ankles. "I can't imagine letting myself go like that." Adrian would watch these exchanges with detached amusement, like someone observing an interesting social experiment. He never defended Claire, never asked Scarlett to show respect. The message was clear. Claire's feelings no longer mattered in her own home. The psychological warfare escalated in small, deliberate ways. Scarlett left her things scattered around, her lipstick on the bathroom counter, her jacket draped over the couch, her expensive shoes kicked off in the entryway. Marking territory. Adrian said nothing about it. One evening, Claire walked into the kitchen to find them cooking together. Adrian stood behind Scarlett at the stove, his hands on her hips, guiding her as she stirred something in a pan. They were laughing, comfortable, intimate. When they noticed Claire, the laughter stopped, but neither moved apart. "We're making dinner," Adrian said flatly. "You want some?" Claire's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Adrian, can we talk?" "Privately." "Whatever you need to say, you can say in front of Scarlett. She's part of the team." "The team?" Claire's voice rose despite herself. "She's your mistress, Adrian. This is our home, our baby." "Don't be dramatic." He turned his attention back to the stove. "You're embarrassing yourself." Something inside Claire snapped. She saw the vase on the counter, a Waterford crystal piece worth $800 that Adrian's mother had given them as a wedding present. Claire picked it up and hurled it at the wall. It exploded into 1,000 glittering pieces. The room went silent except for Claire's ragged breathing. Adrian pulled out his phone immediately and started recording. "Claire, you need to calm down. You're scaring me." "Scaring you?" She could hear the hysteria in her own voice and couldn't stop it. "You brought your mistress into our home while I'm pregnant with your child." "You're hysterical. This is exactly what I'm talking about." He kept the camera trained on her. "Claire, you need help. Professional help." "Stop recording me. I'm documenting this for your own safety." His voice was calm, reasonable. "The perfect victim. You're clearly not well." Scarlett had backed against the counter, her face a mask of theatrical fear, playing her role perfectly. Claire realized too late what was happening. He was building a narrative. Unstable wife, violent outbursts, danger to herself and the baby. She forced herself to breathe, to steady her voice. "Delete that video." "I can't do that. I have to protect our child from your instability." It was masterfully done. In less than 2 minutes, Adrian had turned her moment of justified anger into evidence against her. Claire turned and walked to the guest bedroom, the only room she felt safe in anymore. She locked the door and sat on the bed, shaking. In her pocket, her phone buzzed. "Catherine Mills, are you okay? Don't engage with him anymore. We're moving up our timeline." The next morning, a woman arrived at the penthouse. Dr. Ellen Cross, according to her business card. She was 50s, professionally dressed, with cold eyes that assessed Claire like she was a specimen. Mrs. Vale, your husband is concerned about your mental state. I'm here to help. Adrian stood behind her, concern etched on his face. I just want to make sure you're okay, Claire. After last night, Dr. Cross sat up in the living room with a leather portfolio and a sympathetic expression that didn't reach her eyes. The evaluation lasted 45 minutes. Her questions were designed to trap. Do you often feel angry at your husband? Have you had thoughts of harming yourself or others? Do you hear voices that aren't there? Have you ever felt disconnected from reality? Claire answered carefully, but she could see Dr. Cross writing notes with increasing frequency. Whatever she said was being twisted into pathology. When it was over, Dr. Cross closed her portfolio with a definitive snap. Mr. Vale, I recommend immediate intervention. Your wife is exhibiting signs of paranoid ideation, emotional dysregulation, and potential risk to herself and the fetus. I'm recommending a 72-hour psychiatric hold for comprehensive evaluation. Claire's blood turned to ice. What? No, I'm not. This is for your own good, dear. Dr. Cross's smile was patronizing. And for your baby's safety. The next morning, 2 EMTs arrived with a court order signed by a judge Claire had never met. Adrian must have worked quickly, must have called in favors, must have greased the right palms. Mrs. Vale, we're here to transport you to Bellevue Hospital for evaluation. No, Claire backed away. I'm not going. I'm not crazy. He's lying. Ma'am, we have a legal order. Please don't make this difficult. Adrian stood in the hallway, tears in his eyes. Fake tears, theatrical tears. I'm so sorry, Claire. But you need help for the baby. I'm doing this because I love you. As the EMTs approached with the restraints, Claire saw Scarlett in the doorway of the office, watching, and she was smiling. They strapped Claire to the gurney despite her protests. She screamed Adrian's name, begged them to listen, tried to explain that this was all a setup. But psychiatric patients always say they're not crazy. That's what everyone expects them to say. The ambulance doors closed, and through the window, Claire saw Adrian standing in front of their building. He lifted his hand in a small wave. This was the third peak of despair, not just trapped, not just powerless, but actively erased, declared insane, locked away, her baby still inside her, and she couldn't protect either of them. At Bellevue's psychiatric ward, they took her clothes, her phone, her dignity. They gave her sedatives that made thinking difficult. They put her in a white room with a locked door and a window that didn't open. Claire lay on the narrow bed, numb with medication and defeat, and whispered to the ceiling, God, if you're real, please help me. Please send me Jackson. She didn't expect an answer, but 36 hours later, a nurse named Betty, kind face, soft voice, entered with her evening medication. As she handed Claire the paper cup of pills, she slipped something else into her hand. A burner phone. Someone's been trying to reach you, Nurse Betty whispered. A friend of your brother's. Claire's fingers closed around the phone like it was salvation itself. Later, alone in her room, she turned it on. One number was saved in the contacts. She pressed call with shaking hands. One ring, two. Then a voice she hadn't heard in 10 years. Claire, Dominic Ashford. I need help, she sobbed. Please, I need help. I know. His voice was steady, sure, unshakable. I'm already working on it. Hold on for 12 more hours. Can you do that? I don't know. You can. You're Jackson's sister. You're stronger than all of them. 12 hours, Claire. She closed her eyes and whispered, Okay. I promised Jackson I'd watch out for you. I'm keeping that promise now. 12 hours later, at 6 in the morning, a federal judge overturned the psychiatric hold. The ruling was scathing, insufficient evidence, rights violated, potential corruption in the initial order. Rachel Pierce was waiting outside in a black SUV when they released Claire. She still wore hospital scrubs. Her hair was unwashed. Her eyes were hollow. But she was free. Rachel handed her a phone, clothes, a bottle of water. Mr. Ashford wants to meet with you. No pressure, but he has information you need to hear. Claire took the water with trembling hands. Where is he? The Hamptons. 2-hour drive. Claire looked at the hospital behind her, then at the road ahead. Behind her was Adrian in his carefully constructed trap. Ahead was unknown, but it was offered by the one person who'd known Jackson, who'd made a promise at a funeral 10 years ago. "Let's go," she said. And as the SUV pulled away from Bellevue, Claire Hartford Vale took her first breath of free air in weeks. The war wasn't over. But she was no longer fighting alone. The drive to the Hamptons felt like crossing into another world. Manhattan's steel and concrete gradually gave way to open stretches of Long Island, then to tree-lined roads and glimpses of ocean. Claire sat in the back of the SUV, wrapped in the clothes Rachel had brought. Soft cotton, loose-fitting, nothing like the designer prison Adrian had kept her in. Rachel didn't push conversation. She simply drove, occasionally glancing at Claire in the rearview mirror with an expression that seemed to say, "I know. I understand. You're safe now." When they finally pulled up to Dominic Ashford's estate, Claire's breath caught. It was nothing like Adrian's cold penthouse. The house was modern but warm, glass and stone that seemed to grow from the landscape rather than dominate it. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Atlantique. The morning sun painted everything gold. "He's waiting on the terrace," Rachel said gently. Claire walked through the house in a daze. Everything felt surreal, the soft carpets, the comfortable furniture, the books on shelves that looked actually read. In Adrian's penthouse, books were decoration. Here, they were companions. The terrace overlooked the ocean, waves rolling in with ancient rhythm. A table was set with breakfast. Simple, thoughtful. Fresh fruit, yogurt, pastries, coffee that smelled like heaven. And there, standing at the railing watching the water, was Dominic. 10 years had added silver to his temples and lines around his eyes. But he was unmistakably the same man who'd stood beside her at Jackson's funeral. Tall, solid, with the kind of quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself. He turned when he heard her footsteps. His eyes took in her appearance. The hospital scrubs, the exhaustion, the way she held herself like someone who'd been hit too many times. Claire. Just her name, but it held everything. Recognition, concern, a promise being kept. Dominic. Her voice cracked on his name. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and pulled her into a hug. Not romantic, not paternal, just human. The kind of hug that says, "You survived, you're here, that's enough." Claire broke. All the terror and rage and despair she'd been holding came pouring out. She sobbed into Dominic's shoulder while he held her steady, murmuring, "I've got you. You're safe. I've got you." When the storm finally passed, he guided her to a chair. Rachel appeared with water and tissues, then disappeared again with perfect discretion. "I'm sorry," Claire managed. "Don't be." Dominic sat across from her. "You're entitled to break down. You've been through hell." "How did you know?" "I only sent that email from the hospital. I've been keeping tabs on you since you married Adrian Vale." At her shocked expression, he continued, "I promised Jackson I'd watch out for you. When you got married, I ran a background check on Adrian. Nothing alarming came up. He was good at hiding it. But about 6 months ago, my forensic accountants flagged some irregularities. I started digging deeper." He slid a folder across the table. "This is what we found." Claire opened it with shaking hands. The first document showed shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. The names on the registrations, Scarlett Ross, Natalie Cole, 2 other women Claire didn't recognize. "Adrian's been running a fraud scheme for 18 months, Dominic explained, embezzling from his firm's client accounts, laundering the money through these companies. Total theft, $18 million. The next document made Claire's stomach drop. Her signature, clear as day, on financial forms she'd never seen before. "He forged these?" "Yes, open credit lines in your name. If the fraud is discovered, the paper trail leads to you. He was planning to frame you for his crimes." Claire thought of the post-nuptial agreement Adrian had wanted her to sign, the one that would have left her with nothing in a divorce. She thought of the psychiatric evaluation, the 72-hour hold, the careful construction of her as unstable. "He was going to take my baby," she whispered, "frame me for fraud, declare me unfit, and take my baby." "Yes." The final document was the worst. Preliminary custody paperwork already filed with the court. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks away, right before Claire's due date. He's claiming you're mentally unstable and financially irresponsible, Dominic said quietly. He's building a case for full custody before the baby is even born. Claire looked up at him, and her fear crystallized into something harder, something sharper. What do I need to do? Dominic's expression shifted. He'd been watching to see if she'd crumble or fight. Now he saw the answer. First, you stay here. This guest house, he pointed to a smaller building visible through the trees, is yours for as long as you need it. Private entrance, 24/7 security. Adrian doesn't know where you are. He'll find out eventually. Let him try. This property has better security than most embassies. Second, we file for divorce immediately. My legal team is the best in the state. We cite financial abuse, fraud, emotional abuse, and we include all of this evidence. Will that be enough to stop the custody case? It's a start, but we need more. We need testimony from Adrian's other victims. Dominic pulled out his phone and showed her a document. Scarlett Ross has been cooperating with federal investigators for 3 weeks. She's scared and realized Adrian was using her. She'll testify. The woman from the hotel, Natalie? She's agreed to testify too. Turns out Adrian promised to marry her as well, and she's angry enough to burn him down. Claire felt dizzy with information. How long have you been planning this? Since the day I got your email from the hospital, actually longer. I've had investigators watching Adrian since those first financial red flags. When you reached out, everything accelerated. Claire looked at him. Why go through all this for me? Dominic leaned back, and for the first time, something softened in his expression. Do you remember what I told you at Jackson's funeral? Claire searched her memory. That day was mostly blur and rain and grief. I was standing next to you while they lowered the casket, Dominic said. You were crying so hard you could barely stand, and I put my hand on your shoulder and said, if you ever need me, really need me, call, always. I remember. Her voice was barely a whisper. I meant it. Jackson was my best friend. He asked me the night before he died to watch out for you if anything happened to him. At the time, I thought he was being paranoid. College kids don't think about dying. But then he did. Yeah. Dominic's jaw worked. And I've spent 10 years trying to keep that promise from a distance, checking in through mutual friends, making sure you were okay. When you married Adrian, I wanted to believe you'd found someone good. But the moment my team flagged those financial irregularities, I knew. I knew he was dangerous. You could have warned me. You wouldn't have believed me. You loved him, or thought you did. Some lessons can't be taught. They have to be survived. Claire absorbed this. The man who'd been a ghost from her past had been watching over her for a decade, waiting for the moment she'd need him. What happens now? She asked. Now we build a case so strong that Adrian Vale never touches you or your daughter again. And then, Dominic's expression turned fierce. We make him pay for every single crime he's committed. Claire thought of Adrian in the penthouse, probably celebrating his victory, thinking he'd successfully isolated her, broken her, set her up to take the fall for his fraud. When do we start? She asked. Dominic smiled. We already have. Over the following 6 weeks, Claire Hartford Yale transformed. Not in the fairy tale makeover sense, though there were new clothes and proper nutrition and hair that actually got styled. The real transformation was deeper. She worked with attorney Catherine Mills every day, learning the law, understanding her rights, building her case. She met with a real psychiatrist, Dr. Miranda Hall, who specialized in trauma and abuse, and began processing the psychological warfare Adrian had waged. She recorded phone calls from Adrian, who still didn't know where she was. His voice alternated between threats and apologies, rage and manipulation. Claire, where are you? You're carrying my child. Come home. I know you're scared, baby, but we can work through this. If you don't return, I'll have you declared an unfit mother. I'll take our daughter. I love you. Why are you doing this to us? Every call was documented, every threat recorded. The case against him grew stronger daily. Claire also worked with Dominic's security team, learning how to protect herself. They taught her to spot surveillance, to vary her routines, to trust her instincts. Adrian was a predator, and predators didn't give up easily. But the most important transformation was internal. Claire stopped apologizing, stopped second-guessing, stopped making herself small. She was done being Adrian's victim. At 38 weeks pregnant, Claire went into labor at 3 in the morning. Dominic drove her to the hospital himself, a private wing registered under a false name for security. Rachel stayed with her through the entire 14-hour ordeal, holding her hand through contractions, feeding her ice chips, coaching her breathing. At 6:23 in the morning, Ella Grace Hartford entered the world. Not Ella Vale, Ella Hartford. Claire used her maiden name on the birth certificate. When they placed the baby in Claire's arms, tiny, perfect, with a full head of dark hair in her mother's nose, Claire wept. But these were different tears. Not despair, not fear, joy mixed with fierce, protective love. "We're free now, baby," she whispered. "We're free." Adrian didn't know his daughter had been born. He wasn't at the hospital. He didn't get a phone call. He had no legal right to information anymore. The divorce papers had been filed 2 weeks earlier. The custody paperwork he had submitted was countered with evidence of fraud, abuse, and criminal conspiracy. Federal investigators had officially opened a case into his embezzlement scheme. Adrian Vale's perfect life was unraveling, and he still didn't know the final blow was coming. 8 weeks after Ella's birth, the Bright Horizons Gala sent out its invitations. The same event where Adrian had paraded Scarlett. The same event where Claire had been humiliated. This year, Claire was attending too, and this time she wasn't hiding. The transformation was complete. Claire stood in front of the full-length mirror in Dominic's guest house, barely recognizing herself. The emerald green gown had been chosen specifically for its message: wealth, power, confidence. It hugged her post-pregnancy figure without apology, custom-tailored to perfection. Her hair fell in elegant waves. Her makeup was flawless, but understated. Diamond earrings, borrowed from Rachel, caught the light. But it wasn't the clothes that made her look different. It was her eyes. They held steel now. "You're ready?" Dominic asked from the doorway. He wore a classic tuxedo, looking every bit the billionaire CEO. But more importantly, he looked like someone who'd have her back. "I've been ready for months." Claire checked her clutch one final time. Inside, the tablet with the hidden camera footage, her phone, and the USB drive containing every piece of evidence they'd compiled. "Remember the plan?" Dominic's tone was gentle but firm. "Let Scarlett make the first move. Don't engage with Adrian directly. Wait for the signal from Catherine before showing the evidence. And most importantly, stay calm," Dominic finished. "He wants you to break. Don't give him that." Rachel appeared with baby Ella in a designer bassinet, all ivory lace and sleeping innocence. "She's fed and changed. She'll sleep through most of it." Claire touched her daughter's cheek softly. Bringing Ella to the gala was strategic, a visual reminder to everyone that Adrian had abandoned his pregnant wife. But it was also personal. Ella deserved to be there for her mother's victory. The drive to the Metropolitan Museum of Art felt both endless and too fast. Claire's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady. She'd practiced this moment in her mind hundreds of times. The black SUV pulled up to the museum's steps. Photographers lined the entrance like hungry wolves. The moment the door opened, cameras began flashing. Dominic stepped out first, then extended his hand to Claire. She took it and emerged into the night, into the lights, into the beginning of Adrian's end. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Gasps, whispers, conversations stopping mid-sentence. "Oh my God, is that Claire Vale? She's with Dominic Ashford. Is that her baby? She looks incredible." Rachel followed with Ella's bassinet, and the photographers went wild. The image was too good. The abandoned wife returning with a billionaire ally and the baby her husband had never met. The narrative was already shifting in real time. Inside the Great Hall, the gala was in full swing. The same chandeliers, the same orchestra, the same crowd of Manhattan's elite. But this time Claire walked in as a different person. She scanned the room and found Adrian immediately. He stood near the center, Scarlett on his arm in her signature crimson red. They were laughing at something, completely unaware. An investor nudged Adrian. "Adrian, your wife." He turned, and the expression that crossed his face was worth everything. Shock, rage, fear, all flickering in rapid succession before he forced his features into calm. Scarlett followed his gaze. Her smile faltered. Claire simply walked past them, head high, not giving them the satisfaction of acknowledgement. She could feel Adrian's eyes burning into her back, could practically hear his mind racing to understand how she'd escaped his trap. People approached cautiously, uncertain. These same people had witnessed her humiliation months ago. Now they didn't know which side was winning. "Claire, you look wonderful," someone said. "Congratulations on the baby," said another. She accepted their pleasantries with grace, not bothering to point out that none of them had checked on her when Adrian had her committed to a psychiatric ward. 20 minutes passed. The tension in the room built like static before a storm. Adrian was conferring with someone urgently. Scarlett looked increasingly uncomfortable, her champagne consumption accelerating. Then Scarlett broke. She stormed across the room, champagne sloshing in her glass, and planted herself in front of Claire. "You've got some nerve showings up here." Claire met her eyes calmly. "I came to thank you, actually." Scarlett blinked, thrown. "For what?" "For being exactly as stupid as I needed you to be." The nearby conversation stopped. People leaned in. "Excuse me?" Scarlett's voice rose shrilly. Claire pulled the tablet from her clutch and handed it to Scarlett. "Watch this." On the screen, crystal clear from Claire's hidden camera footage, Adrian sat in his office talking to his lawyer. The audio was perfect. "Scarlett's just a pawn. Once Claire's out of the picture, I'll dump her too. She's too dumb to know I'm using her Instagram LLC to launder money. The moment the feds start sniffing around, everything leads to her and Claire. I walk away clean." The color drained from Scarlett's face. She looked up at Adrian, who was pushing through the crowd toward them. "You said you loved me," Scarlett whispered. "Scarlett, don't listen." Adrian reached for the tablet, but Scarlett jerked away from him. "You lied to me!" Her scream echoed through the hall. The orchestra's music faltered and stopped. She threw her champagne in Adrian's face. The room erupted. Gasps turned to excited murmurs. Phones came out. This would be on social media within minutes. Adrian stood there, dripping champagne, his carefully constructed image crumbling. "You're making a scene." "You want to see a scene?" Scarlett pulled out her own phone with shaking hands. "I've been recording you for months. Every lie, every transaction, every time you talked about framing Claire." She started airdropping files to every nearby phone. People's devices pinged in rapid succession, a digital domino effect. Investors, board members, journalists, everyone began receiving the evidence simultaneously. Text messages appeared on screens around the room. "The shell companies are registered in Scarlett's name. If this blows up, she takes the fall." Claire signed the post-nup without reading it. "She's locked out of everything." The psychiatric hold was brilliant. Now she looks unstable if she tries to fight back. The room exploded into chaos. Board members began making urgent phone calls. Investors huddled together, checking their phones with increasingly horrified expressions. The journalists present were frantically typing, sensing the story of the year. Adrian tried to grab his phone, probably to call his lawyer. But attorney Catherine Mills, who'd been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward. "Mr. Vale, I wouldn't make any calls right now. The FBI is already on their way." As if on cue, the main doors opened. FBI agent Marcus Stone entered with 4 other agents, all wearing the expression of people who'd been waiting for this moment. "Adrian Vale, you're under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, identity theft, and money laundering." Adrian's face went white. "This is a mistake. I can explain." "You'll have plenty of time to explain downtown." Agent Stone nodded to his team, and 2 agents moved in with handcuffs. Adrian tried to run. He actually tried to run through a ballroom full of witnesses. Security blocked the exits. He was cornered, trapped, exposed. The handcuffs clicked closed around his wrists with a sound that rang through the silent hall. "You did this!" Adrian snarled at Claire as they led him past her. "You destroyed me." Claire looked at him with perfect calm. "No, Adrian, you destroyed yourself. I just made sure everyone saw it. Agent Stone turned to Scarlett. Mr. Ross, you're not under arrest. We have your cooperation agreement. Scarlett, mascara streaming down her face, nodded shakily. She looked at Adrian one final time. I'm not going down with you. You bitch! Adrian screamed as the agents pulled him toward the door. You ruined everything! Actually, Claire said quietly, though her voice somehow carried across the entire hall, you did that yourself the moment you thought you could break me. The agents led Adrian out through a tunnel of phones, capturing every moment. The sirens from the waiting vehicles outside mixed with the crowd's shocked murmurs. Claire stood at the center of it all, Dominic at her side, baby Ella sleeping peacefully in her bassinet. Investors who'd ignored her before suddenly wanted to apologize, to distance themselves from Adrian, to offer support. Mrs. Vale, it's Ms. Hartford, Claire corrected gently. And no, you didn't know, but you suspected. You all suspected. You just didn't care enough to ask. She turned to Dominic. I'd like to go home now. Of course. As they walked toward the exit, the crowd parted like water. Some faces showed respect, some showed shame. All of them understood that they'd just witnessed a reckoning. The night air felt cool and clean after the stifling atmosphere of the gala. Claire breathed deeply, feeling lighter than she had in months. You did it? Dominic said softly. We did it, Claire corrected. I couldn't have done this without you. Rachel was already waiting with the SUV. As they drove away from the Metropolitan Museum, Claire looked back one time. Ma'am. Police lights flashed. Reporters swarmed. Adrian's empire was collapsing in real time. She turned forward, toward home, toward Ella, toward whatever came next. The war was over. She'd won. The trial of Adrian Vale became a media sensation. Every major network covered it. Every tabloid ran headlines. The story had everything: wealth, betrayal, a pregnant wife, multiple mistresses, and millions in fraud. Manhattan society couldn't look away. Claire attended every day of testimony, dressed in simple, elegant clothes, her face composed. She'd become a symbol, not of victimhood, but of survival. Women reached out to her constantly. Her inbox overflowed with messages. Thank you for fighting back. You gave me the courage to leave. You saved my life by sharing your story. On the witness stand, Claire was devastating. Attorney Catherine Mills walked her through the timeline of Adrian's abuse with precision. When did you first suspect your husband was having affairs? 5 months into my pregnancy. I found a receipt for dinner for 2 at Per Se. He'd told me he was at a board meeting. What did you do with that information? I started documenting everything. I opened a secret email account and began photographing evidence. Why didn't you confront him immediately? My OBGYN had warned me that severe stress could trigger preterm labor. I was only 5 months pregnant. I had to protect my baby first. The jury listened with rapt attention as Claire described finding Adrian with Natalie, the hospital collapse, the frozen bank accounts, Scarlett moving into the Pennant house, the psychiatric evaluation, the 72-hour hold. When she finished, several jurors were wiping their eyes. Adrian's lawyer tried to discredit her during cross-examination. Isn't it true, Ms. Hartford, that you had a documented history of mental instability? No, I had a documented history of my husband systematically trying to have me declared insane so he could steal my child and frame me for his crimes. Your Honor, the defense attorney objected. Sustained. Ms. Hartford, please just answer the question. But the damage was done. The jury had heard it. Scarlett testified next, crying through most of her statement. She admitted she'd been complicit in the fraud initially, thinking it was just Adrian being smart with taxes. When she'd realized he was planning to frame both her and Claire, she'd started recording everything. Did Mr. Vale ever express love for you? Catherine asked. He said he did, but I heard the recording of him calling me stupid, calling me a pawn. He never loved me. He used me. Natalie Cole's testimony was equally damaging. She'd been pregnant with Adrian's child, truly believing he would leave Claire and marry her. She'd miscarried at 7 months. The stress of being Adrian's secret had literally killed her baby. He told me Claire was cold, unloving, that their marriage was over in everything but paperwork, Natalie said, her voice breaking. He said as soon as the baby was born, He'd file for divorce and we'd be together. I believed him. I lost my daughter believing his lies. By the time Julia Brennan, the fourth mistress, testified, the pattern was undeniable. Adrian was a serial predator who'd perfected the art of manipulation. The forensic accountants explained the financial fraud in excruciating detail. $18 million embezzled over 18 months, laundered through shell companies, with careful paper trails leading to Claire and Scarlett. If Ms. Hartford hadn't discovered the fraud and contacted Mr. Ashford's team, would she have been implicated? Almost certainly. The documents were expertly forged. It would have appeared that she was either complicit or the mastermind. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing came 2 weeks later. Claire sat in the courtroom as the judge read the verdict. Adrian Vale, you have been found guilty of wire fraud, embezzlement, identity theft, money laundering, and conspiracy. Your crimes were not crimes of desperation or necessity. They were crimes of greed, arrogance, and cruelty. You systematically destroyed the woman who trusted you, attempting to steal her child and her freedom to cover your own sins. This court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison and orders you to pay $25 million in restitution. Adrian's face crumbled. He looked toward Claire one final time, and she saw something she'd never seen before. Genuine fear. Good. The divorce settlement came through 3 weeks later. Judge Rebecca Stone, the same judge who'd overturned Claire's psychiatric hold, presided over the proceedings. Given the evidence of Mr. Vale's fraud, abuse, and attempted theft of marital assets, this court awards Miss Claire Hartford the following: full custody of Ella Grace Hartford with no visitation rights for Mr. Vale until such time as he completes his prison sentence and undergoes mandatory psychological evaluation. $140 million in assets, representing half of Mr. Vale's remaining worth, the penthouse property in Manhattan, and all rights to marital property acquired during the marriage. Claire immediately sold the penthouse. She couldn't spend another night in that cold marble prison. The Buildings Association bought it for market value, probably wanting to erase the scandal from their address. She used part of the money to pay back Dominic for the legal fees, security, and housing costs. He'd refused initially, but she'd insisted. You saved my life, let me pay my debts. You don't owe me anything, Claire. Then call it repaying the favor Jackson did for you. Whatever it takes, but let me do this. He'd accepted finally, understanding that financial independence mattered to her. The rest of the money went into 2 trusts, one for Ella's future and one to fund a new foundation. Claire called it Ella's Promise. Its mission? Helping women escape financial abuse. She hired a staff of lawyers, accountants, counselors, and advocates. Within 6 months, they'd helped 200 women leave abusive relationships with legal protection and financial security. Claire moved to Boston, away from Manhattan's chaos. She bought a beautiful brownstone in Beacon Hill, warm, comfortable, filled with books and light. Nothing like Adrian's penthouse. This was a home. Ella thrived. At 1 year old, she was a happy, curious toddler with her mother's eyes and a smile that could light up rooms. She'd never known her biological father, and that was probably for the best. Claire's mother, Diane, retired from nursing and moved into an apartment nearby. After 40 years of healing others, she finally had time to help raise her granddaughter. Life became something Claire had forgotten it could be. Peaceful. But peace, she would learn, was fragile. 6 months after Adrian's conviction, Claire received a visitor. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Ella was napping. Claire was reviewing grant applications for the foundation when her doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw Julia Brennan standing on her front step, looking nervous. Claire opened the door. Julia, is everything okay? I need to tell you something. Julia's voice was tight with anxiety. About Ella. Claire's heart stopped. What about her? Can I come in? They sat in Claire's living room, tea cooling between them. Julia twisted her hands in her lap, clearly struggling with how to begin. Before Adrian went to prison, she finally said, he told me something. He said he'd already done a paternity test on Ella. He said, she looked up, eyes brimming with tears. He said she's not his. The words hit like a physical blow. That's impossible. He swapped the DNA sample somehow. I don't know the details, But he did it so that when he gets out, he can sue you for fraud, claim you tricked him into thinking she was his daughter. He wants to destroy you even from prison. Claire's mind raced. Why are you telling me this? Because he's a monster, and I'm done protecting monsters. Julia stood. I'm sorry, Claire, for everything. I hope you can forgive me someday. After Julia left, Claire sat in the darkening living room, mind spinning. Was Adrian actually Ella's biological father? Could he have falsified a paternity test? She called Dominic immediately. I need a paternity test. Today. Can you arrange it? Of course, what happened? She explained Julia's visit. Dominic was quiet for a moment, then said, I'll have a lab send someone to your house within the hour. We'll expedite the results. The technician arrived 45 minutes later. She swabbed Ella's cheek and took a sample from Claire. Results in 48 hours. Those 48 hours felt like 48 years. When Dominic called to say he was bringing the results personally, Claire knew it was serious. He wouldn't come all the way from the Hamptons unless something was wrong. He arrived at sunset, still in his business suit, carrying a sealed envelope. They sat in the living room, the same room where Julia had delivered her warning. Dominic held the envelope but didn't immediately give it to her. Claire, whatever this says, nothing changes. Ella is your daughter. She's a year old. She knows you as her mother. Adrian has no claim to her, biological or otherwise. But if he's not her father, then he's even more of a monster than we thought, and we'll burn that bridge when we come to it. Claire took a deep breath. Just tell me. You should open it yourself. She took the envelope with shaking hands, tore it open, pulled out the single sheet of paper, read the result. Adrian is her biological father. She looked up at Dominic. How did Julia think otherwise? Because Adrian lied to her, it's what he does. He probably planned to claim later that he'd been deceived, manufacture evidence of a fake affair, destroy your reputation even from prison. Claire stared at the paper. Part of her had hoped Ella wasn't Adrian's, that there would be no biological connection to that man. But biology didn't determine family. She stood, walked to the fireplace, and threw the paternity test into the flames. Dominic raised his eyebrows. What are you doing? Some truths don't need to be spoken. She watched the paper curl and blacken. Ella's mine. That's all that matters. If Adrian tries to claim later that she's not his, we'll deal with it. But I won't let him use biology to stake a claim on my daughter. Dominic watched the fire consume the evidence, then said quietly, if you'll let me, I'd like to be in Ella's life, not as her biological father. I'd never try to replace or claim that, but as someone who cares about her and about you. Claire looked at him, this man who'd kept a promise to her dead brother, who'd saved her life, who'd stood beside her through the worst period of her existence without asking for anything in return. I'd like that, she said. Dominic's expression softened. Good, because Ella deserves to have someone teach her how to play chess, and God knows you're terrible at it. Despite everything, Claire laughed. It felt good. It felt normal. Outside, rain pattered against the windows. Inside, the fire crackled warmly. Upstairs, Ella slept peacefully, dreaming whatever one-year-olds dream about. And for the first time in years, Claire Hartford felt something she'd forgotten existed. Contentment. But she also knew better than to trust peace completely. Adrian was in prison, but men like him never truly gave up. They waited, they plotted, they looked for weaknesses. So Claire would stay vigilant. She would protect her daughter. She would keep building her foundation, helping other women escape what she'd survived. And she would never, ever be a victim again. 1 year later, the beach house in Cape Cod felt like a dream. Weathered gray shingles, white trim, enormous windows that caught the morning light and threw it across hardwood floors. Claire had rented it for a long weekend, a celebration of sorts. 1 year since Adrian's conviction. 1 year of freedom. Ella was 2 now, running on toddler legs that were still learning balance. She shrieked with delight as waves chased her up the sand, then retreated with the tide. Her dark hair, so much like Claire's, whipped in the ocean breeze. Mama, water! She pointed with chubby fingers. I see it, baby, Claire called from her beach chair, smiling. Dominic was there too, building an elaborate sandcastle with turrets and a moat. He'd become a fixture in their lives over the past year, not as a replacement for anything, just as Dominic. Steady, present, kind. Ella called him Dom Dom and climbed on him like he was playground equipment. They'd settled into an easy rhythm. He'd drive up from the Hamptons or down from New York every couple of weeks, always texting first to make sure it was okay. Sometimes he'd stay for dinner, sometimes just for coffee. He never pushed for more, and Claire appreciated that. Because she needed time. Time to be just Claire and Ella. Time to rebuild herself without jumping into another relationship. Time to prove she could stand on her own. The foundation had grown faster than she'd imagined. Ella's promise now had offices in 5 states and had helped over 800 women escape financial abuse. Claire spoke at conferences, wrote op-eds, appeared on podcasts. She'd become a voice for survivors, not because she'd sought the spotlight, but because she had a story that needed telling. Last month, she'd been invited to testify before Congress about financial abuse legislation. She'd sat in front of cameras and microphones and told her story to the people who made laws. Financial abuse is insidious, she'd said. It doesn't leave bruises, it leaves you trapped. No money, no resources, no way out. We need laws that protect victims, that make it harder for abusers to freeze accounts or forge documents. We need banks to flag suspicious activity. We need courts to recognize financial abuse as the form of domestic violence that it is. The legislation was still pending, but there was momentum. Real change might actually happen. Her mother visited often, delighting in her granddaughter. Diane had finally sold the house in Charlotte, too many memories of Robert and Jackson, and bought a condo in Boston to be close to Claire and Ella. "You did good, honey," Diane had told her daughter one night over wine. "Your father would be so proud." Jackson, too. Claire thought about Jackson often. How he'd have loved Ella. How he'd have probably threatened Adrian with bodily harm long before things got bad. How his friendship with Dominic had, in a strange way, saved Claire's life years after Jackson's death. Life wasn't perfect. Some nights, Claire woke from nightmares. Adrian's face, the hospital, the feeling of being trapped. Her therapist said that was normal, that trauma takes time to heal. But the nightmares were getting less frequent, and she was happy, actually happy. Not the desperate, dependent happiness she'd felt with Adrian in the beginning, but something quieter and deeper, the happiness of a life she'd built herself on her own terms. Now, watching Ella play in the sand while Dominic constructed increasingly ridiculous castle additions, Claire felt peace settle over her like a warm blanket. "Hey," Dominic appeared beside her chair, holding 2 beers. "Ella's distracted by a crab. We have approximately 4 minutes before she needs us." Claire took the beer gratefully. "A whole 4 minutes? What luxury." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the ocean. After a moment, Dominic said, "I want to ask you something, but I don't want to pressure you." Claire's stomach tightened. "Okay. There's a charity event in New York next month, at the Met. I was wondering if you'd consider going. With me, as more than friends." She turned to look at him. He was watching the horizon, giving her space to think. "Dominic, you can say no, I'll understand. But I needed to at least ask, because this past year, being part of your life, watching you rebuild, seeing you with Ella." He finally looked at her. "I'm in love with you, Claire, and I'm willing to wait as long as you need. But I wanted you to know." Claire's heart hammered. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately. But another part, the part that had been burned, hesitated. "I care about you," she said carefully, "but I'm scared, not of you, of making the same mistake again, of trusting the wrong person. I'm not Adrian. I know that intellectually, but emotionally, I'm still learning to trust my own judgment again." Dominic nodded slowly. "What if we start smaller? Not the Met, just dinner, no pressure. We see how it feels." "I'd like that," Claire smiled. "But not in New York, too many memories. Maybe here in Boston?" "Deal." He clinked his beer bottle against hers. Now, before Ella realizes we're not watching. "Mama, Dom-Dom, crab!" Ella's voice carried across the beach. They hurried over to investigate the crab, which was indeed very exciting if you were 2 years old. Dominic patiently explained about hermit crabs while Ella listened with serious attention. That evening, after Ella was asleep in the beach house's small upstairs bedroom, Claire sat on the deck with her laptop, answering emails for the foundation. Dominic had gone for a walk on the beach, giving her space. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She almost deleted it. She got a lot of spam, but something made her open it. The message contained a single photo, an empty prison cell, door hanging open. Below it, they say he killed himself, but did he? Claire's blood turned to ice. She enlarged the photo. It was definitely a prison cell, and it was definitely empty. A second message appeared. Some men don't die, they wait. Her hand started shaking. She called the number. It went straight to voicemail, not even a greeting, just a tone. She immediately called Catherine Mills, her lawyer. Catherine, I just got a weird text about Adrian. What kind of text? Claire described the messages and sent screenshots. Catherine was quiet for a moment, then said, Stay where you are. I'm calling my contact at the bureau. Is Adrian? I'll find out. Don't panic. This could be someone trying to scare you. But Claire's instincts screamed otherwise. She walked inside and double-checked all the doors and windows. The security system Dominic had insisted she install showed green lights, armed and functioning. When Dominic returned from his walk 20 minutes later, he found Claire sitting rigid on the couch, phone in her white-knuckled grip. What's wrong? She showed him the messages. His expression darkened. When did you get these? 15 minutes ago, I called Catherine. She's checking with the FBI. Dominic pulled out his own phone and made a call. Marcus, Dominic Ashford, I need you to confirm Adrian Vale's location. Right now, I'll wait. 3 minutes of tense silence. You're sure? No chance of an error? Okay, thanks. He hung up and turned to Claire. Adrian's in his cell. Marcus confirmed it personally. Someone's playing games. Who would do that? Could be anyone. Adrian has enemies now. Or it could be some troll who read about your case and thought it would be funny to scare you. Claire wanted to believe that, but the cold dread in her stomach wouldn't dissipate. I'm staying tonight, Dominic said, not asking, stating. On the couch, just in case. Claire nodded gratefully. That night, she barely slept. Every sound made her jump. The house creaking, the wind against windows, the ocean's constant roar that had seemed soothing earlier now felt ominous. At 3 a.m., she gave up and went downstairs. Dominic was awake too, sitting on the couch with his laptop. Can't sleep either, he asked. Every time I close my eyes, I see that empty cell. He closed his laptop and patted the couch beside him. Claire sat, and after a moment leaned against his shoulder. I thought it was over, she whispered. I thought I was safe. You are safe. Adrian's in prison. Whoever sent those messages is just trying to get in your head. They succeeded. Dominic wrapped an arm around her. Listen to me, you survived Adrian at his most powerful. You brought down a man who'd convinced the world he was untouchable. Some anonymous coward texting you pictures isn't going to break you now. Claire wanted to believe him. She closed her eyes and focused on his steady breathing, the solid warmth of him beside her. I'm tired of being afraid, she said. Then stop giving power to ghosts. Adrian's done. He can't hurt you anymore. And even if he could, Dominic's voice hardened, he'd have to go through me first. It wasn't romantic. It was simply true. And somehow that made it more comforting than any pretty words would have been. Claire fell asleep on that couch, Dominic's arm around her, and for the first time in weeks, her dreams were peaceful. Morning came with the sound of waves and Ella's cheerful voice calling for breakfast. Claire woke on the couch, blanket tucked around her, that she didn't remember pulling over herself. Dominic was in the kitchen making pancakes while Ella helped by eating chocolate chips directly from the bag. For a moment, everything felt normal again. Catherine called at 9 a.m. with news. I traced that number. It belonged to a burner phone purchased in Newark 3 days ago. Used once to send you those messages, then destroyed. We can't track who bought it. So we have nothing? We have confirmation that Adrian's exactly where he should be. Security footage shows him in his cell from midnight to 6 a.m. He couldn't have sent those messages. Then who? Could be another inmate. Could be someone on the outside with an axe to grind. Adrian made a lot of enemies. My guess? Someone who knows your story and wanted to rattle you. Don't give them that power. It made sense logically. But emotionally, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rest of the vacation passed without incident. They returned to Boston on Sunday evening, and life resumed its normal rhythm. Foundation work, therapy appointments, toddler tantrums, the ordinary beautiful chaos of single motherhood. Dominic took her to dinner the following Friday, a small Italian restaurant in the North End where they ate pasta and talked about everything except Adrian. It felt good, normal, safe. "I could do this again," Claire said over tiramisu. "The tiramisu or the date?" "Both," she smiled, "but especially the date." Something shifted between them that night. Not a dramatic change, just a gentle opening. The possibility of something more. Over the next 3 months, they fell into a pattern. Dinner once a week, occasional weekend visits. He was patient, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. Ella adored him, which helped. Then on a Tuesday afternoon in November, Catherine called with news that stopped Claire's world. "Adrian's dead." The words didn't make sense at first. "What?" "They found him in his cell this morning. He'd hanged himself using a bedsheet. I'm so sorry, Claire. I know this must be." "How do they know it was suicide?" "There was a note, and the cell was locked from the inside." Claire sat down heavily in her desk chair. "What did the note say?" "It was addressed to you. The prison is sending it through my office for review. You should have it by the end of the week." After hanging up, Claire stared at nothing for a long time. Adrian was dead. The man who'd terrorized her, tried to destroy her, attempted to steal her child. Dead. She should feel relief, closure, victory. Instead, she felt nothing. Just numbness. When Dominic arrived that evening, she'd texted him the news. He found her sitting in the dark living room, Ella asleep upstairs. "Are you okay?" he asked, sitting beside her. "I don't know what I am." Claire's voice was hollow. "He's gone. Really gone. And I feel nothing. Shouldn't I feel something?" "There's no should. Feel whatever you feel." "Part of me is relieved. Part of me is angry that he took the easy way out. Part of me is just tired." Dominic took her hand. "You don't have to have it figured out tonight." Adrian's note arrived on Friday. Catherine reviewed it first, then called Claire. "It's not threatening, mostly rambling, but there's a section you should read." The envelope arrived by a courier that afternoon. Claire made herself a cup of tea, sat at her kitchen table, and opened it with shaking hands. The note was 3 pages of Adrian's familiar handwriting. Most of it was self-pitying nonsense about how he'd been wrongly convicted, how the world had turned against him, how no one understood his genius. But the final paragraph was different. "Claire, I know you think I'm a monster. Maybe I am. But I loved you once in my way, before the money and the power made me forget how. I'm sorry for what I did to you. I'm sorry for what I became. Ella deserves better than me. You both do. This is the only decent thing I can give you, my absence. Tell Ella her father was a man who made terrible mistakes but wanted better for her, or tell her nothing. Either way, she'll be better off. Goodbye." Claire read it 3 times, looking for hidden meanings, for manipulation, for one last trap. But it seemed genuine as someone like Adrian could be in his final moments. She folded the note carefully and placed it in a fireproof box in her office. Maybe someday Ella would want to read it. Maybe not. That would be her choice when she was old enough to make it. That night, Claire called her therapist. "He's dead. Adrian's dead, and I don't know how to feel about it." Dr. Hall listened patiently, then said, "You survived him. That's what matters. However you feel about his death is valid. Relief, anger, sadness, nothing at all. There's no wrong answer." "I thought I'd feel more something. Closure, maybe." "Closure is a myth, Claire. What happened to you doesn't get tied up with a neat bow, but it does become part of your story instead of the defining feature of your story. You're already doing that work." Over the following weeks, Claire processed Adrian's death in therapy, in quiet moments, in conversations with Dominic and her mother. The nightmares actually decreased, as if her subconscious understood he couldn't hurt her anymore. The media had a field day with the story, of course. Disgraced millionaire dies in prison cell. Adrian Vale's final message. But Claire didn't read the articles. She'd lived the reality. She didn't need the sensationalized version. Christmas came. Claire, Ella, Diane, and Dominic spent it at the brownstone, making cookies and watching holiday movies. It was Ella's first Christmas she'd really understand, and her delight in the lights and presents made everyone laugh. On Christmas night, after Ella and Diane were asleep, Claire and Dominic sat by the fireplace with wine. "Thank you," Claire said quietly. "For what?" "For keeping Jackson's promise, for saving my life, for being patient with me. You saved yourself, I just provided resources. You provided more than that. You provided hope when I'd forgotten what it looked like." Dominic was quiet for a moment, then said, "Claire, I need to tell you something. About that text you got, the one with the empty prison cell." Her heart stopped. "What about it?" "I sent it." The world tilted. "What?" "Not the original one. That was real, sent by someone we still haven't identified. But I had Marcus investigate thoroughly. We found out it came from an inmate in Adrian's block who'd been released 2 days before. He was trying to scare you on behalf of Adrian. It was Adrian's idea, one last way to torment you." Claire's hands clenched around her wine glass. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I needed you to see that you were stronger than your fear. If I'd told you it was really Adrian's doing, you would have been terrified until his death. Instead, you faced the fear and realized it couldn't break you." "You should have told me. You're right, I'm sorry." Dominic met her eyes. "I made a choice to protect you, and in doing so, I took away your agency. That was wrong. If you want me to leave and never come back, I'll understand." Claire sat with that for a long moment. Part of her was angry. He'd kept information from her, made decisions for her, but another part understood he'd been trying to help. "I don't want you to leave," she said finally, "but I need you to promise me something. Anything. No more secrets. No more protecting me from information I deserve to have. I've been lied to and manipulated enough. If we're going to do this, actually do this, I need complete honesty, even when you think it's for my own good." "I promise," he took her hand. "Complete honesty from now on, about everything." "Okay." She squeezed his hand. "Then here's my honesty. I'm in love with you. I've been fighting it because I was scared, but I am. And if you're willing to be patient with my trauma and my baggage and my sometimes irrational fears, I'd like to see where this goes." Dominic pulled her close and kissed her. Soft, gentle, asking permission with every movement. She kissed him back, feeling something inside her chest unlock. When they broke apart, he said, "I can handle trauma and baggage. I've got my own. We'll figure it out together." And for the first time in years, Claire let herself believe in a future that wasn't defined by her past.